Saren Alcott thought she knew her past. Cale Drayden believed his silence kept her safe. But when a hidden basement door is unlocked after the death of their cold and secretive stepfather, Dorian Vexley, the horrifying truth unravels. What they uncover beneath their childhood home isn't just linked to a string of unsolved disappearances. It reveals a forgotten brother, a trail of hidden victims, and a twisted legacy that reaches into the life of Saren's closest friend, Maeve Solon. This is not just a story of buried bones. It's a haunting unraveling of trust, memory, and a killer who hid in plain sight. Saren Alcott had lived most of her life in the same weathered two-story house on Wrenwood Lane. To neighbors, she was the quiet nurse with a soft voice and gentle eyes who always helped sick children at the county hospital. Her life seemed ordinary, even dull, a woman wrapped in routine and silence. No one knew that she'd avoided her own home's basement for more than 2 decades. When Saren was 17, her mother died in a tragic car accident. Her stepfather, Dorian Vexley, had taken over guardianship of Saren and her younger brother Cale. Dorian was wealthy, cold, and deeply private. He had no known family, few friends, and a temper that could silence a room with just a glance. After their mother's funeral, he set down one firm rule: the basement was off limits. He locked the door, took the only visible key, and said it was for everyone's safety. Saren had obeyed without asking questions. Cale, only 11 at the time, had nodded and said nothing. Years passed. Saren grew up, moved out briefly for college, then returned when Dorian's health began to fail. She took care of him during his final year. When he died, no one came to the funeral. His will left everything to her, including the aging house. Saren decided to clear it out and sell it, wanting to escape the memories that seemed to hang like fog in every room. One rainy afternoon, while sorting through Dorian's things, Saren found a strange old book tucked in the corner of his study. It wasn't one she recognized. It was hollowed out, and inside was a small brass key, tarnished and cold to the touch. Her heart skipped. The shape matched the basement lock, long sealed and ignored. For hours, she sat with the key in her hand, unsure if she should open the door. Finally, just before sunset, she walked to the basement, placed the key in the lock, and turned it. The click was soft, like a breath exhaled after years of being held. The basement stairs creaked under her weight as she descended. The air was thick with dust and silence. A single pull-string light illuminated the room, casting flickering shadows on the cracked concrete walls. Old furniture lay draped in yellowing sheets. Shelves lined with tools, broken lamps, and cardboard boxes filled the space. Everything was frozen in time, untouched since her childhood. She walked slowly, brushing cobwebs from her sleeves, taking in the eerie stillness. Then something caught her eye behind the rusted water heater. A faint seam in the wall that didn't match the rest. She stepped closer. The panel was made of drywall, slightly bowed outward, clearly newer than the surrounding walls. Her instinct stirred. This wasn't just a basement. Something had been hidden. Saren called Cale, now a forensic lab technician, and told him what she found. He arrived an hour later, gloves in hand, eyes shadowed with unease. They worked in silence, breaking through the drywall. Dust burst into the air with each swing of the hammer, revealing a narrow passage behind the false wall. Inside was a hidden room, small and windowless. It looked like a crude playroom. Children's drawings, some smeared and crumbling, were taped to the walls. An old mattress lay on the floor. A broken toy piano sat in the corner. Saren felt her knees weaken. This wasn't just storage. This had been lived in. She could feel the fear still clinging to the air like a thick, invisible fog. At the center of the room was a metal trunk. It was dented, locked, and covered in dust. Kyle pried it open with a crowbar. The hinges screamed as the lid creaked back. Inside were small, brittle bones, partially wrapped in a moth-eaten blanket. There were also faded Polaroid photos, images of children, all under 10, staring blankly into the camera, none of them familiar. Saren backed away. The bile rose in her throat. Dorian had been hiding more than personal demons. This was something monstrous. Kyle immediately called Maeve Solon, Saren's best friend and a seasoned social worker. Maeve arrived, pale and trembling, her voice shaking as she urged them not to touch anything else. They had to involve someone who understood what this meant. someone who might connect the dots. Maeve made one phone call that changed everything. She reached out to Lark Halden, a retired detective who had once led an investigation into several missing children in Evermere. He had always believed the truth was buried somewhere in that neighborhood. He just never knew it had been beneath that very house the whole time. Saren stared at the hidden room, the bones, the silent photos. For the first time in her life, she wondered if Dorian's evil had left scars deeper than she ever understood. And she feared what else might still be waiting in the shadows. The investigation began quietly, behind closed doors, as Lark Halden stepped back into a world he thought he had left behind. Though retired for nearly 10 years, he had never let go of one case, 5 missing children, all from the same town, all gone within a 6-year span, all seemingly vanished without a trace. No suspects were ever charged. No bodies were ever found. But now, standing in the basement of Saren Alcott's childhood home, Lark knew the silence had been hiding something all along. Cale stayed back while the forensics team arrived. His face was pale, his body tense, as if every moment spent in that house pulled him deeper into memories he had buried. Saren, despite the horror, remained composed. She answered questions, signed paperwork, and walked through the timeline again and again. Every step was a reminder of how close they had lived to the unspeakable. Inside the hidden room, the evidence told its own story. The small bones were confirmed to be human, estimated to belong to a child no older than 9. The old Polaroids, around 20 in total, depicted different children in varying states of distress. Some were playing with toys, others lying on the same mattress they found in the hidden space. None of the children appeared in more than one photo, and none of them were Saren or Cale. Lark recognized one of the faces almost immediately, a boy with dark curls and a striped shirt, the same boy who disappeared from the Evermere Park in 1997. His name had been Milo Granger. He'd gone missing on a sunny afternoon, never to be seen again. His parents had moved away after 2 years of unanswered questions. Lark remembered the search. He remembered the interviews, the dogs, the volunteers, and he remembered Dorian Vexley being questioned briefly, once. The man had been calm, firm, and entirely forgettable, nothing suspicious in his record. Just another stepfather with a quiet life and a well-manicured lawn. Now everything made sense. Maeve worked with police to cross-reference the photos with missing children reports. Within days, 4 more identities were tentatively matched. All of them had been listed as long-term disappearances, and each case had gone cold by the early 2000s. There was no connection between the families. Different neighborhoods, different backgrounds, different years. But one thing stood out: every child had vanished within a 6-mile radius of Saren's home. Forensic experts continued their search and discovered another chilling detail. A second set of smaller bones had been buried beneath the concrete floor, right under the mattress. These bones were more degraded, older. Unlike the first body, these remains had no associated photographs or clothing. It was as if this victim had been forgotten entirely, even by the killer. As the news spread through police channels, Lark became obsessed with one question: why these children? What was the connection between Dorian and the victims? It didn't seem random, but there was no obvious pattern either. No abuse reports, no missing signs pointing to him, no witnesses. He had operated in plain sight, a predator in a suburban mask. Meanwhile, Saren found herself spiraling. She kept walking through the house, tracing the places where Dorian had spent the most time. His study, the garage, the sunroom where he smoked his cigars. Everything felt stained, as if the walls themselves had watched his crimes in silence. She couldn't stop wondering if she'd missed signs, if her childhood had been nothing more than a carefully constructed lie. Every memory was under question. Every kindness from him now seemed like a calculated distraction. Cale became quieter with each passing day. He avoided the basement, refused to speak to police, and spent hours alone in the attic sorting through boxes no one had touched since they were children. One night, Saren found him staring at a picture of their family. Dorian, their mother, herself, and Cale. He said nothing, only placed the photo face down before walking away. Lark stayed longer than he had planned, digging into old files, requesting DNA tests, pushing through bureaucratic red tape. The second body found under the concrete was too deteriorated to identify immediately, but preliminary results suggested something disturbing, a biological relation to Cale. That meant the victim was likely a family member, perhaps a half-sibling, a child no one had ever known about. This new information shattered what little stability remained. Saren demanded answers from the adoption center, where Dorian once worked as a volunteer during the 1980s. The center, long since closed, had no surviving records. It was as if the child had never officially existed. Now the case wasn't just about serial murder. It was about secrets hidden deep within Saren's own family. The line between victim and accomplice blurred. The house had held more than bones and photos. It held questions no one wanted to ask. And the worst part was, this was only the beginning. The revelation of a biological connection between Cale and one of the victims set off a wave of confusion, fear, and questions no one was prepared to answer. The DNA results were clear. The remains found buried beneath the basement floor belonged to a young boy who shared nearly half of Cale's genetic material. That ruled out any possibility of coincidence. It suggested that Dorian Vexley had hidden something even darker than child abduction. He had erased a child from history, one who was family. Saren spent days trying to find records, scoring old documents, photo albums, hospital bills, anything that might give her even a fragment of truth. But there were no birth certificates, no school records, nothing to indicate that another child had ever lived under their roof. Their mother's medical history was vague, scattered, and full of unexplained gaps. One entry hinted at a pregnancy lost under complex circumstances, several years before Saren was born, but the notes were too cryptic to understand fully. Had their mother given birth to a son no one ever spoke of, or had Dorian brought this child into their home from somewhere else? Lark Halden grew more obsessive as the days went by. He pulled archived adoption files, hospital logs, even old tax records. Eventually, he uncovered something deeply unsettling. In 1986, Dorian Vexley had legally adopted a child through a now-defunct private agency. The file was thin, the paperwork oddly incomplete, and the adoption was finalized and then dissolved within a year. The child's name had been Elias Vexley. That name had never once been mentioned by Saren or Kyle. There were no photos of him in the house, no traces of his existence. It was as if Dorian had tried to scrub him out of memory entirely. But Elias had existed, and now he had been found, buried and forgotten, a child hidden in plain sight beneath their home. Kyle refused to speak about it. His silence deepened, his expressions more hollow each day. Saren watched her brother withdraw completely, haunted not only by what they were discovering, but by something else. Something he wasn't saying. She confronted him, begged him to talk, but Kiel locked himself in his room and left no answers. Meanwhile, forensic analysts continued sorting through the Polaroids found in the basement. One photo showed a child gripping a stuffed owl, standing in the corner of the hidden room. His face was familiar to Lark. It matched a boy reported missing from a nearby town decades ago. Sammy Cordell, age 7. His case had gone unsolved in 1998. Another photo depicted a girl with long braids and scraped knees, sitting beside a toy piano. She, too, had vanished around the same time. Every new face matched a name from old missing persons files. Every connection led back to the same neighborhood. But still no one understood why. Dorian had no criminal record, no history of abuse or violence. He had passed background checks, maintained a clean public life, and never raised suspicion from teachers, neighbors, or even his own stepchildren. Saren and Cale had grown up under the same roof, yet neither of them had known what was happening below their feet. Then came the unexpected breakthrough. An old shoebox, found buried behind insulation in the attic, contained a series of cassette tapes. Most were blank or too degraded to play, but one tape still worked. On it, Dorian's voice could be heard clearly. He spoke in a calm, rehearsed tone, explaining his belief that some children were broken and needed to be repaired through structure and silence. He described taking in children he deemed lost causes from unstable homes. He didn't believe he was hurting them. He said he was saving them from the chaos of the world. The words were chilling. He had documented his crimes in his own voice and framed them as acts of twisted mercy. Saren listened in horror. This wasn't just a predator. They had lived with a man who saw himself as a savior, a judge, a punisher. And the deeper they looked, the more it became clear that Elias, her unknown half-brother, may have been his first victim, the beginning of a pattern that spiraled out of control. Kyle finally emerged from his silence with one trembling sentence. I remember him. The memory had been locked away for decades, but Kale recalled a boy. Quiet, shy, always sick. Elias had lived in the house, briefly. He had been kept mostly in the basement, and one day, he was simply gone. Their mother had told them he went to live with relatives. Kyle had believed it. But now, the truth shattered everything he thought he knew about their family. What started as a mystery of strangers had turned into a horror rooted in blood. The story wasn't just about victims taken from the outside. It was about what had been done within their own home. And what Kale remembered next would send the case spiraling into even darker territory. Kale's quiet confession that he remembered Elias opened a floodgate. In the days that followed, fragments of repressed memories began surfacing, scattered and unclear at first, but each one drawing a more horrifying picture of the past. He remembered being 6 or 7, peering through a crack in the basement door, watching a pale boy sit silently in the dark. Elias didn't speak much. He was thin, always cold, and had strange bruises that no one talked about. Their mother rarely mentioned him, and when she did, her tone was clipped and emotionless, as if Elias was an obligation rather than a son. And then one day, without warning, he was gone. Kyle never asked where he went. He had been too afraid of Dorian's silence, too afraid of the house's shifting moods. Saren listened in numb disbelief. Elias had been real, her brother. She tried to picture him, imagine what his life had been like, trapped in that house, beneath their feet, forgotten and unloved. The guilt pressed down on her with unbearable weight. How had she never known? How had they all let this happen? Lark, meanwhile, pursued another angle. He requested school enrollment records from the early 90s. It took time, but eventually he confirmed Elias had been enrolled at a private learning center for a short period, under a different last name. Dorian had hidden him in plain sight, using a fabricated identity. The boy had attended for just 4 months. Then his name disappeared. No withdrawal, no transfer, just silence. The administrators from that era had long retired, and the files were dusty and incomplete. But one handwritten note stood out. Child appears withdrawn, undernourished. Referred to counselor. Father declined follow-up. That counselor's name was tracked down. A woman named Ruth Calder, now living in a retirement home an hour outside of Evermere. Lark drove there immediately. Ruth, now in her 80s, remembered Elias vividly. She described him as sweet but distant, always staring out the window during lessons. He never mentioned family. But once, he had drawn a picture of a house with bars on the basement windows. When asked what it meant, he said, "That's where I sleep when I'm bad." Ruth had reported the conversation to the principal, but nothing was done. She hadn't heard the name Elias Vexley since, until now. With each detail, the story of Elias came more into focus. He had lived, suffered, and died unnoticed. The boy Saren and Kale never got to know was buried, not just in the ground, but in their memories. Saren couldn't stop replaying every quiet moment from her childhood. Every locked door, every strange noise, every night Dorian had gone down to the basement while they slept. All of it made sense now. But it wasn't over. Kale became increasingly unstable. His sleep was disturbed by nightmares. He stopped going to work. Saren found him standing in the basement more than once, staring at the place where Elias had been buried. His hands shook, and he began keeping a journal, filled with disjointed phrases. He was always there. "I didn't help. It's my fault." One morning, Saren found him missing. His phone was left behind. No note, just his journal, open to a page that read, "There's more he didn't tell us." Police found Cal later that evening, wandering a wooded area near the edge of town. He was barefoot, dazed, muttering about the others. He had gone to the forest searching for something, though he couldn't say what. After being taken to the hospital, it was decided he needed psychiatric care. The trauma had finally broken through. Before being admitted, he revealed one final truth to Saren. He remembered, faintly, a second room in the basement. one even deeper, hidden beneath a trapdoor covered by shelves. Cal said he had seen Dorian pull it open once, years ago. Saren, overwhelmed but desperate for answers, returned to the basement that same night. She moved every shelf, every piece of furniture, searching for the spot Cale had described. Finally, behind a stack of unused paint cans, she found a thin seam in the concrete floor, almost invisible. With trembling hands, she pried at the edge. A square slab lifted, revealing a dark, narrow crawlspace. She shone her flashlight into the hollow. Inside were boxes, labeled by year, stacked in perfect order. Each one contained remnants of lives, stolen toys, hairbrushes, clothing, small shoes, personal items stripped from each victim. A meticulous record of every child Dorian had taken. Saren couldn't breathe. This wasn't just a killer's trophy room. It was an archive. A twisted library of suffering. There had been more than 5 children. More than 10. The truth had only begun to surface, and one label stood out from the rest, marked with a name no one recognized yet. One final secret Dorian had taken to the grave. The box that caught Saren's eye was marked A. Solon 2002. The name didn't appear in any case file, any missing persons list, or any archive Lark Halden had ever seen. But Saren recognized the last name immediately. Maeve Solon, her best friend since college. Her confidante, the one who had helped report the bones, who had guided her through every revelation. The room spun. Her hands trembled as she opened the box. Inside were small belongings. A child's sock with a cartoon dog, a drawing of a sun and 3 stick figures, a red plastic beret. A photo was tucked between the items. It showed a little girl no older than 6, standing in a yard that looked eerily similar to Saren's childhood home. Her face was round and smiling, her hair tied back with a red clip. On the back of the photo, in Dorian's handwriting, were the words, Esley, quiet, obedient, prefers silence. Saren's heart dropped. Maeve had never mentioned having a sister. She had once said she grew up in foster care, but never spoke of siblings. The realization hit like a wave. Dorian had taken Esley. And somehow, Maeve either didn't know, or had chosen to forget. Saren confronted Maeve that evening, barely able to get the words out. At first, Maeve denied everything. Her face was calm, practiced. But then, cracks began to show. Her voice trembled. She said she had blocked it all out. That there had been a sister, yes, but she vanished one night when Maeve was only 10. Their foster parents told her Esley had been moved to another home. She believed it because no one gave her a reason not to. She had buried the grief, convinced herself it was a bureaucratic decision. Now, with the photo in her hands, Maeve collapsed. She had been helping Saren solve a mystery that looped back to her own tragedy. She stayed silent for a long time, before finally whispering something neither of them would forget. I used to dream of her calling my name. I thought it was guilt. But she was trying to be found. Lark returned to the house with a search warrant. Every box in the hidden crawlspace was cataloged. The total number of victims reached 17. Most had never been reported missing by families, runaways, foster children, kids from unstable homes, children who slipped through the cracks and vanished without a trace. Dorian hadn't just targeted the innocent. He had hunted the forgotten. Among the boxes were several tapes, recordings of Dorian's monologues, confessions, and delusions. In one, he described Elias's death in disturbing detail, claiming he had failed the transition and reverted. Another tape, dated 2002, discussed how he had found another quiet one through someone in the foster system. Lark traced the dates and discovered Dorian had once briefly worked with a state-funded counseling service, where Maeve and Esley had received regular therapy. That's where he found her. Maeve couldn't bring herself to listen to the tape. She left town for several weeks, disappearing without telling Saren where she had gone. The grief was too raw, the betrayal too deep. Cale, still institutionalized, sank deeper into himself. Doctors diagnosed him with dissociative episodes and complex PTSD. In moments of clarity, he spoke of Elias, how Dorian had punished him for crying, how he heard his screams through the vents. Cale said he used to press his ear to the floor at night, hoping the sounds would stop. When they finally did, he thought it meant Elias had escaped. Now he knew better. Saren sold the house within the month. She refused to take any of the belongings with her. She signed the property over to the city. Under one condition: the house would be demolished. Nothing would stand on that land again. The council agreed, and the demolition was carried out in silence, without ceremony. Only Lark stood nearby, watching the dust rise. The victims were given names and identities. Memorials were held. Families were contacted. Those that remained. A plaque was placed in Evermere Park, where many of the children had last been seen. It read, "For the voices that were lost, and the silence that finally spoke." Saren moved far from Evermere. She changed her phone number, left her job, and started over. No interviews, no statements. She lived a quiet life, working in a hospice, surrounded by fading lives and final truths. Sometimes, on early mornings, she would sit by the window and stare at nothing for hours. In the end, there were no happy endings. No justice that could balance the weight of so much loss. But there was truth, dug up from the dark. And that, perhaps, was enough. Dorian Vexley had built a prison beneath his home. But the walls he constructed with fear and silence had finally crumbled. What was hidden had been dragged into the light. And though the damage could never be undone, the dead would no longer be buried in silence.